But tonight, that revolutionary design faced its ultimate test. The German night fighter had appeared without warning. A Messerschmitt Bf-110 emerging from the darkness like a predator scenting blood. Its pilot, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of the Nachjagdgeschwader II, had perfected the art of the upward-firing cannon installation known as Schräg Musik slanted music, a weapon system that allowed him to approach unseen from below and behind. Weber's first burst had been exploratory, feeling out the bomber's defenses. His second had been surgical, targeting the port engine with the precision of a butcher's knife. Ward fought the control column as the Wellington lurched violently to the left. Behind him, Sergeant Peter Collins, the wireless operator, was already transmitting their position back to Bomber Command headquarters, knowing that if they went down, at least the brass would know where to start looking for bodies. The navigator, Officer Thomas Blackwood, frantically recalculated their course, trying to find the shortest route to Allied territory while the aircraft hemorrhaged altitude at 300 feet per minute. The third burst from Weber's cannons walked a line of destruction from tail to nose. Metal screeched as bullets punched through the fabric skin, severed control cables, shattered instruments, and transformed the once pristine interior into a screaming chaos of wind and noise. According to documentation preserved in the Royal Air Force Museum archives and Hendon sources that would later provide crucial details about this engagement, the German pilot fired a total of 4 separate attacks, expending nearly all his ammunition in a determined effort to bring down the stubborn British bomber. Flight engineer Dennis Hughes watched the oil pressure gauge for the starboard engine drop into the red zone. Coolant temperature climbed. The hydraulic system pressure fluctuated wildly. Every instrument told the same story. This aircraft was dying, and soon the crew would die with it. Yet Ward kept flying, kept fighting the controls, kept the nose pointed toward home with a determination that bordered on supernatural stubbornness. The Messerschmitt broke away after its 4th attack, either out of ammunition or convinced that the crippled Wellington would never make it home. Hauptmann Weber would later file his combat report, claiming a probable kill standard procedure when a bomber disappeared trailing smoke into the darkness. He couldn't have known that his probable kill had other ideas about survival. As the immediate threat receded, the crew of our 4 Robert took stock of their situation, and what they found should have been a death sentence. The fabric covering the fuselage flapped and tore in the slipstream, exposing the geodetic framework like bones showing through torn flesh. The port engine was completely dead, its propeller windmilling uselessly in the airstream. The starboard engine coughed and sputtered, running on borrowed time and prayer. Multiple fuel tanks had been punctured, creating a mist of volatile aviation gasoline that filled the fuselage with explosive fumes. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, the rear gunner, emerged from his turretor, what remained of it crawling through the damaged fuselage, with blood streaming from a scalp wound. He'd counted at least 40 bullet strikes in his position alone, including one that had passed so close to his head it had taken a chunk out of his flight helmet. Without touching skin, the perspex canopy of his turret looked like someone had attacked it with a sledgehammer, spiderwebbed with cracks and punctured in a dozen places. Navigator Blackwood made calculations that defied optimism. At their current altitude of 8,000 feet and descending, with only partial power from one engine, they had perhaps 40 minutes of flight time remaining before physics made the final decision about their fate. The nearest friendly airfield was Royal Air Force Coltishall in Norfolk, still over 300 miles of hostile territory, the North Sea, and the English coast. The mathematics were unforgiving. They wouldn't make it. Ward made a decision that would later earn mentions in operational records, preserved at the National Archives in Kew. Instead of ordering the crew to bail out over occupied Holland where they'd face either death or years in a prisoner-of-war camp, he would fly this dying aircraft until it could fly no more. If they were going down, they'd do it over England, where at least their families might recover the bodies. The wireless operator Collins tapped out another position report, this one more urgent. He'd already destroyed his codebooks and encryption materials, standard procedure when capture seemed imminent. But something remarkable happened as he transmitted. Stations across southern England picked up his signal and began tracking our 4 Roberts' progress. Word spread through Bomber Command that a Wellington was trying to make it home against impossible odds, And suddenly this wasn't just one crew's fight for survival, it was becoming a symbol of the stubborn defiance that characterized the entire strategic bombing campaign. Bomb aimer Sergeant William Foster, working by flashlight in the devastated nose section, discovered damage that should have killed them all. A 20mm cannon shell had passed through the bomb bay without detonating, missing their high explosive payload by inches. If that shell had struck just slightly differently, our 4 Robert would have become a fireball over Germany, contributing nothing but another statistic to the night's losses. The crew worked with desperate efficiency, each man knowing his survival depended on the others. O'Brien and Foster moved through the fuselage, stuffing torn fabric into holes, trying to reduce the drag that threatened to stall them out of the sky. Hughes coaxed every possible revolution per minute from the failing starboard engine, constantly adjusting the fuel mixture and propeller pitch. Over the Dutch coast, our 4 Robert crossed from occupied Europe into the uncertain safety of the North Sea. At an altitude of just 4,000 feet, the starboard engine was producing barely 60% power, running so rough that Hughes expected it to tear itself apart at any moment. Every instrument on the panel showed readings that existed somewhere between critical and catastrophic. The fuel gauges had become unreliable, punctured tanks, making accurate measurement impossible. They were flying on fumes and willpower, nothing more. Ward discovered that the control surfaces had been damaged more severely than initially assessed. The elevators responded sluggishly, requiring constant correction. The rudder had taken multiple hits, leaving a gap in the control surface that created unpredictable yaw. Most critically, the trim system had been shot away entirely, meaning Ward had to maintain constant pressure on the control column to keep the nose level. His arms already burned with fatigue, and they still had perhaps 30 minutes of flight time ahead if the engine lasted, if the fuel held out, if structural failure didn't tear the aircraft apart. The wireless operator Collins established contact with Royal Air Force Coltishall, informing them of our 4 Roberts' condition and requesting emergency landing clearance. The duty officer at Coltishall later recorded in the operations logbook documentation that historians would reference decades later that, upon hearing the Wellington's damage report, he assumed they'd be recovering wreckage, not survivors. Nevertheless, he ordered the crash crews to full alert and had the runway emergency lighting activated. Despite blackout protocols, Navigator Blackwood provided updated position reports every 5 minutes, tracking their painfully slow progress across the North Sea. At 90 miles per hour, significantly below the Wellington's normal cruising speed of 190, every mile felt like an eternity. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, its geodetic structure flexing in ways Barnes Wallis had designed, but certainly never intended as routine. Metal creaked, fabric tore further, and the wind howled through 100 holes in the fuselage. At one point, approximately 40 miles from the English coast, the starboard engine lost all oil pressure. The cylinder head temperature spiked into ranges that should have resulted in immediate seizure. Flight engineer Hughes watched the gauges with the fascination of a man observing his own execution, knowing that when that engine quit, they'd have no choice but to ditch in the frigid North Sea. Water temperature in May hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill through hypothermia in less than 30 minutes, even if they survived the impact. But the engine kept running, kept producing thrust, kept defying every law of thermodynamics and mechanical engineering that said it should explode into flaming debris. Hughes would later describe it as the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard, that rough, irregular clatter of pistons still firing despite having every reason to quit. The English coast materialized out of the darkness like salvation carved from chalk and shadow. Norfolk's distinctive coastline meant safety, meant home, meant they might actually survive this nightmare. But Ward knew the hardest part still lay ahead. Landing a badly damaged bomber with compromised controls on a single engine at night wasn't flying, it was controlled catastrophe management. Royal Air Force Coltishall's duty officer, Squadron Leader Henry Matthews, stood in the control tower watching the eastern sky with mounting tension. Radio reports from R4 Robert had become increasingly grim during its final approach. The Wellington was barely maintaining altitude, flying at speeds that put it dangerously close to stalling. with structural damage that made every maneuver a gamble against catastrophic failure. Matthews had ordered every available piece of emergency equipment to the runway's edge. Fire trucks stood ready with their crews aboard, foam cannons charged and ready. Ambulances idled with their engines running and medical personnel prepared for casualties. The station's engineering officer, Flight Lieutenant Charles Pemberton, had assembled a damage assessment team, though privately he doubted there'd be anything to assess beyond scattered wreckage. Ward lined up his approach from the east, giving himself maximum distance to stabilize the aircraft's descent. The Wellington responded to control inputs with the enthusiasm of an arthritic cart horse, every adjustment requiring exaggerated movements and careful anticipation. The missing hydraulic pressure meant the landing gear had to be cranked down manually, a process that took precious minutes and muscle while the aircraft continued its descent toward the dark earth. Bomb aimer Foster and rear gunner O'Brien worked the manual gear extension system, cranking the mechanical linkages that lowered the main wheels into position. The nose wheel dropped and locked, followed by the port main gear, but the starboard main gear, damaged by cannon fire, refused to fully extend. It hung at an angle, partially deployed but not locked, creating an asymmetric configuration that virtually guaranteed a ground loop on touchdown. Hughes informed Ward of the gear situation with clinical calm. They'd trained for the scenario, though training and reality occupied different universes. Ward would have to touch down on the port main gear and nose wheel first, keeping weight off the damaged starboard side as long as possible. When the starboard gear inevitably collapsed or failed, he'd have to prevent the aircraft from cartwheeling by using differential braking and rudder, except his rudder was damaged and his brakes required hydraulic pressure he no longer possessed. The math was simple. This landing would be a crash they might walk away from. At 200 feet altitude, Ward reduced power on the starboard engine to idle. The Wellington settled into a descent that felt more like falling with style than controlled flight. The runway lights at Coltishall created a corridor of illumination that represented the difference between survival and oblivion. Ward's arms screamed with fatigue from fighting the control column for over an hour, but he maintained precise pressure, keeping the nose level, the wings stable, the descent rate manageable. 100 feet. The damaged fabric covering the wings vibrated violently in the airstream, creating a sound like machine guns firing. 50 feet. The geodetic framework visible through tears in the fuselage looked like exposed ribs on a skeleton. 25 feet. Collins braced himself against the wireless operator's desk. Blackwood assumed crash positions in the navigation station. Foster and O'Brien wedged themselves into the fuselage, away from anything that might become a projectile on impact. Ward pulled back on the control column, flaring the Wellington for touchdown. The port main gear kissed the runway first, exactly as planned, followed immediately by the nose wheel. For one perfect moment, our four Robert balanced onto wheels, defying the damage that should have killed it. Then physics reasserted itself. The starboard gear touched down, immediately buckled under the weight, and the Wellington lurched violently to the right. Metal screeched against concrete as the collapsed starboard landing gear dragged along the runway, throwing sparks into the night like a welder's torch. Ward stood on the port rudder pedal with every ounce of strength remaining in his exhausted legs, fighting the ground loop that threatened to send them cartwheeling off the runway into the grass beyond. The port brake, operating on residual hydraulic pressure, grabbed intermittently, helping arrest the rightward swing, but creating a lurching, jerking motion that threatened to tear the weakened fuselage in half. The Wellington skidded sideways for what felt like an eternity, but lasted perhaps 5 seconds. The damaged starboard wingtip dipped, touched the runway surface, and scraped the long concrete. The propeller of the dead port engine, which had been windmilling throughout the flight, struck the ground and disintegrated in a shower of metal fragments. The entire airframe groaned like a living thing in pain, the geodetic structure flexing to its absolute limits. Then, impossibly, our four Roberts stopped moving. The aircraft sat canted at an angle on the runway. One wheel collapsed, fabric hanging in tatters, but it had stopped. The crew remained frozen for perhaps 3 heartbeats, unable to process that they were alive, that they were home, that the nightmare had ended. Then training reasserted itself. Ward killed the magnetos on the starboard engine. Hughes activated the fire suppression system, Collins grabbed the emergency exit handle and kicked open the fuselage door. They evacuated the aircraft in seconds, tumbling onto the runway and scrambling away from the fuel-soaked wreckage. The crash crews arrived moments later, foam already spraying from their cannons, covering the Wellington in fire-retardant chemicals. But there was no fire. Despite the fuel leaks, the exposed engines, the sparks from metal grinding on concrete, R4 Robert had refused to burn. It had brought its crew home and now sat on that runway like a defiant wounded animal, battered beyond recognition but unbowed. Squadron leader Matthews reached the crew first, his expression transforming from professional concern to genuine astonishment as he counted 6 men walking away from what should have been a fatal crash. Ward, his arms still trembling from the sustained physical effort of flying, rendered a salute that Matthews returned with visible emotion. No words seemed adequate for what they'd witnessed. As dawn broke over Royal Air Force Coltishall on the 4th of May, 1943, the station's engineering teams descended on R4 Robert to conduct the damage assessment. Flight Lieutenant Pemberton walked around the aircraft 3 times before he trusted himself to speak. The Wellington's fabric covering had been shredded in so many places that more geodetic framework was visible than fabric. The tail section looked like someone had attacked it with a shotgun. The port engine was obviously destroyed, but examination of the starboard engine revealed damage that should have caused catastrophic failure hours before it finally quit after landing. Pemberton's team began the painstaking process of cataloging every bullet strike, every cannon shell impact, every piece of battle damage. They found holes in the wings, fuselage, tail, engines, cockpit, and every section of the aircraft. Cannon shells had passed completely through the bomb Bay 1 lodged unexploded in the framework, a deadly souvenir that the bomb disposal team carefully removed. Control cables had been severed and miraculously held by single strands. Fuel tanks showed multiple punctures that by all rights should have resulted in catastrophic fire. The final count, documented in engineering reports that would later be preserved in Royal Air Force historical archives, exceeded 100 separate battle damage instances. Some were grazing strikes that tore fabric without penetrating framework. Others were direct hits that had severed structural members, destroyed systems, and came within millimeters of killing crew members. The rear gunner's turret alone showed 43 separate impacts. Flight Lieutenant Pemberton submitted his initial damage assessment report to the station commander, with a recommendation that R4 Robert be struck off charge military parlance for written off as beyond economical repair. The Wellington had sustained damage that would require essentially rebuilding the entire aircraft. The geodetic framework, while intact, had been stressed beyond normal operational limits. Replacing the fabric covering alone would take weeks. The destroyed port engine needed complete replacement. The damaged starboard engine required a full overhaul that might reveal internal damage, making it unusable. Station Commander Group Captain William Thornton read Pemberton's report, then walked out to the hardstand where R4 Robert sat surrounded by engineering equipment and work lights. He'd been flying operationally since 1939, had seen dozens of damaged aircraft, had written off his share of airframes that couldn't be salvaged. This Wellington should join that list. By every rational metric, the cost and time required to repair it exceeded the value of returning one more bomber to operational status. But Thornton was also present when Ward and his crew had stumbled out of the wreckage, alive against all probability. He'd heard the story of their 5-hour battle for survival. He understood the symbolic value of repairing an aircraft that had refused to die, that had brought its crew home despite sustaining damage that would have destroyed lesser machines. Sometimes decisions weren't about rational cost-benefit analysis. Sometimes they were about sending a message to every aircrew member at Royal Air Force Coltishall. We don't give up on our aircraft, and we don't give up on you. Thornton returned to his office and modified Pemberton's recommendation. R4 Robert would be repaired, and it would fly again. He gave the engineering teams 48 hours to make the aircraft airworthy enough for a test flight, not a full restoration, but a battlefield repair that would prove the Wellington could still serve. It was an impossible timeline that ignored every regulation and procedure about proper aircraft maintenance. The engineering teams worked in shifts throughout the 4th and 5th of May. They cut away the destroyed fabric covering and replaced it with fresh material, working section by section. They spliced severed control cables, installed temporary patches on fuel tanks, replaced destroyed instruments. The port engine was removed entirely, no time for a replacement, so our 4 Robert would fly on one engine for its test flight. The starboard engine received an emergency overhaul, mechanics working through the night to replace damaged cylinder heads and repair the oil system. Electricians rewired destroyed circuits. Hydraulic specialists bypassed damaged lines and installed temporary accumulators to restore brake pressure. Armorers installed a new rear turret, transferred from an aircraft undergoing long-term maintenance. The damaged starboard landing gear was removed, repaired, and reinstalled with reinforcing brackets welded in place to prevent another collapse. Every hour brought new discoveries of damage, each requiring improvised solutions that would never appear in any maintenance manual. Word of the repair effort spread throughout Bomber Command. Engineers from neighboring stations arrived to assist, bringing specialized tools and spare parts. The repair of our 4 Robert became something more than restoring one aircraft. It became a declaration that the strategic bombing campaign would continue, that losses would be replaced, that no amount of enemy action would break the will of the men who flew and maintained these machines. On the evening of the 5th of May, just 43 hours after the emergency landing, Flight Lieutenant Pemberton informed Group Captain Thornton that our 4 Robert was ready for engine runs. The port engine mount remained empty, a permanent asymmetric configuration that made the aircraft technically unairworthy by peacetime standards. But these weren't peacetime standards. These were the standards of a nation fighting for survival. We're good enough to fly was the only standard that mattered. The afternoon of the 6th of May, 1943, brought scattered clouds and moderate winds to Royal Air Force Coltishall acceptable conditions for a test flight of an aircraft that had been rebuilt in battlefield conditions by exhausted engineers working against impossible deadlines. Flight Sergeant James Ward stood beside our 4 Robert, his hand resting on the patched fabric covering the fuselage, feeling the aircraft's presence in a way that transcended the mechanical. He'd volunteered to pilot the test flight over objections from Group Captain Thornton, who'd argued that a fresh pilot should conduct the evaluation. But Ward had flown this particular Wellington through hell and brought it home. He knew every quirk in its damaged control response, every hesitation in its throttle, every sound it made when stressed to braking. If anyone could evaluate whether the battlefield repairs had restored our 4 Robert to operational status, it was the pilot who'd refused to let it die. Flight engineer Dennis Hughes would accompany him, a 2-man crew, for a test flight that would evaluate basic airworthiness without the complications of a full combat load. Hughes had also volunteered, despite regulations that would have allowed him to decline. The rest of the original crew stood on the hard stand, watching their aircraft prepare for flight again. Navigator Blackwood had made calculations showing that a Wellington flying on one engine could maintain altitude but had limited climb performance. Wireless operator Collins had checked and rechecked the radio equipment, ensuring that if something went wrong during the test flight, they could communicate their situation. Ward completed his pre-flight inspection with meticulous attention to detail. The patches in the fabric covering looked crude, but functional. The framework beneath showed signs of stress, but no cracks or failures. The starboard engine's cowling had been hastily repaired with riveted aluminum patches. The empty port engine mount created an asymmetric appearance that would have grounded any aircraft in peacetime, but was simply another improvisation in an era of improvisation. He climbed into the cockpit, Hughes following into the flight engineer's position. The instrument panel showed a mixture of original gauges and replacement instruments transferred from other aircraft. The control column moved through its full range of motion with noticeable resistance where temporary cable splices created additional friction. The rudder pedals responded to pressure, though Ward could feel the repaired linkages weren't quite as smooth as the original system. Hughes initiated the engine start sequence for the starboard engine. The Rolls-Royce Merlin coughed once, twice, then caught with a roar that spoke of mechanical health despite its recent trauma. Oil pressure climbed into the green range. Coolant temperature held steady. Fuel flow showed normal. The propeller pitch control responded smoothly to input. Every system check confirmed what the engineering teams had accomplished in less than 2 days. They'd taken a destroyed aircraft and restored it to something resembling operational status. Ward taxied R4 Robert to the runway threshold, the asymmetric thrust from the single engine requiring constant rudder correction. To maintain directional control, Group Captain Thornton stood in the control tower, watching through binoculars, aware that he'd ordered this repair against regulation and common sense. If the test flight ended in disaster, questions would be asked about why he'd authorized returning a battle-damaged aircraft to flight status without proper depot-level maintenance. At the runway threshold, Ward ran through the abbreviated takeoff checklist. The single engine would provide barely enough power for takeoff, especially with the drag from hastily applied fabric patches and the asymmetric configuration. If the engine failed during takeoff, they'd have seconds to decide between attempting to land straight ahead or trying to turn back to the field, both options that frequently killed pilots who chose wrong. Hughes advanced the throttle to full power. The Merlin's roar increased to a crescendo. Ward released the brakes. R4 Robert accelerated down the runway, slower than normal, the single engine straining against the aircraft's weight, 40 miles per hour. 50, the tail, lifted as airspeed increased. 60, 70, Ward eased back on the control column, feeling for that moment when lift exceeded weight. At 85 miles per hour, significantly faster than a normal takeoff, the Wellington lifted off the runway. The aircraft climbed at perhaps 100 feet per minute, barely enough to clear obstacles, but sufficient to establish a stable flight pattern. Ward retracted the landing gear manually, the hydraulic system lacking pressure to automate the process. Every control input revealed the aircraft's battle-damaged sluggish elevator response, asymmetric aileron effectiveness, rudder that required constant trim adjustment. But R4 Robert flew. It maintained altitude. It responded to control inputs. It was airworthy. Ward flew R4 Robert in a wide circuit around Royal Air Force Coltishall for 30 minutes, testing every aspect of flight performance that could be evaluated without a full combat load. The Wellington maintained altitude easily on single-engine power, though climb performance was minimal. Turns required careful coordination to prevent the asymmetric thrust from inducing a spin. The patch control surfaces responded adequately, if not perfectly. Stall characteristics showed only minor changes from the aircraft's original handling. Hughes monitored every gauge and system throughout the flight, noting that oil consumption was higher than specification, but within acceptable limits for an engine that had been emergency overhauled. Fuel burn matched predictions. Electrical systems remained stable. The hastily repaired airframe showed no signs of structural failure or unexpected vibration. Every measurement confirmed that battlefield repairs, applied with skill and determination, could restore catastrophically damaged aircraft to operational status. After 40 minutes of flight testing, Ward brought R4 Robert back to Coltishall for landing. The approach and touchdown were uneventful, a perfect three-point landing that demonstrated the aircraft's essential airworthiness. As the Wellington rolled to a stop on the taxiway, the engineering teams, who'd worked through to sleepless nights, erupted in cheers. They'd accomplished something that regulations said was impossible, that peacetime procedures would have prohibited, that common sense suggested was foolish. Group Captain Thornton submitted his report to Bomber Command Headquarters at High Wycombe, documenting the battle damage, the emergency landing, the battlefield repair, and successful test flight. His report included Flight Lieutenant Pemberton's detailed catalog of over 100 separate damage instances, making R4 Robert one of the most heavily damaged aircraft to return to operational status in the entire strategic bombing campaign. That report circulated through Bomber Command and eventually reached the desk of Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of Bomber Command. Harris had built his reputation on relentless prosecution of the strategic bombing campaign, accepting high casualties as the inevitable cost of destroying German industrial capacity. But he also understood the psychological value of stories that demonstrated resilience and determination. R4 Robert's survival and return to flight became one of those stories. The Wellington flew operational missions again starting on the 10th of May, 1943, just 7 days after the emergency landing that should have ended its career. Ward and his original crew flew several of those missions in their patched and rebuilt aircraft, though eventually crew rotations split them up, as the inexorable mathematics of operational flying distributed experienced airmen among new crews who needed veterans' knowledge to survive. R4 Robert remained in operational service until August of 1943, when it was finally retired to a training unit after accumulating additional battle damage during a raid on Hamburg. The geodetic framework that had saved Ward's crew finally reached the limits of accumulated stress and required depot-level repairs that were no longer economically justified. The aircraft was struck off charge in November of 1943 and scrapped, its aluminum alloy members recycled into other aircraft that would continue the campaign. The story of R4 Robert's survival entered Royal Air Force legend, told and retold in crew rooms and officers' messes as an example of what Barnes-Wallace's geodetic design could endure. The Wellington bomber would eventually be recognized as one of the most successful British aircraft designs of World War II, with over 11,000 examples produced. But among those 11,000, R4 Robert held a unique distinction: the aircraft that refused to die, that brought its crew home despite sustaining damage that should have been instantly fatal, that flew again just 2 days after an emergency landing that left observers astonished anyone had survived. Flight Sergeant James Ward completed his tour of operations in December of 1943 and survived the war, eventually retiring from the Royal Air Force as a squadron leader in 1958. In later years, when asked about the night of the 3rd of May, 1943, he would credit the Wellington's geodetic structure, his crew's skill, and what he simply called bloody-minded stubbornness for their survival. He never claimed to be a hero, just a pilot who refused to give up on an aircraft that refused to give up on him. The German pilot Hauptmann Friedrich Weber survived the war as well, eventually learning through post-war research exchanges that his probable kill on the 3rd of May had in fact landed safely and flown again. According to accounts compiled by aviation historians, including documentation from the extensive research conducted by the Royal Air Force Historical Society, Weber expressed professional admiration for the crew that had survived his attacks, noting that such resilience exemplified the brutal mathematics of the air war. For every bomber shot down, another proved impossible to kill. In the decades following the war, aviation engineers studied the damage reports from aircraft like R4 Robert to understand the survivability characteristics that made the difference between catastrophic failure and successful emergency landing. The geodetic construction proved remarkably resilient to battle damage, able to maintain structural integrity even when conventional stressed skin designs would have suffered catastrophic structural failure. Modern aircraft designs still incorporate lessons learned from wartime experience with geodetic and semi-monocoque structures. R4 Robert's story represents more than one aircraft's survival. It embodies the determination of crews who flew knowing every mission might be their last, the skill of engineers who kept damaged aircraft flying through improvisation and dedication, and the resilience of machines designed by engineers who understood that in warfare, survival often depends on the margin between adequate and exceptional design. The night of the 3rd of May, 1943, began with a routine bombing mission and should have ended with 7 names added to Bomber Command's casualty lists. Instead, it became a story of survival against impossible odds, of an aircraft that absorbed over 100 hits and refused to fall from the sky, of a crew that fought for 5 hours to bring their crippled bomber home, and of engineers who worked to sleepless days to return that bomber to the sky. In the vast machinery of the strategic bombing campaign, R4 Robert was a single aircraft among thousands, but for the 6 men who flew at home that night, it was everything.